Hello. I read an incredibly powerful novel recently, which continues to haunt me. It's one of those books that I keep thinking about, and it feels so striking that this novel was first published over a decade ago, but very sadly, it continues to be so relevant and topical. It's the book of Disappearance by Ibtisam Azem, translated by Sinan and Antoon. And I was first drawn to the very bold premise of this story, where one day all Palestinian Arabs suddenly vanish from the state of Israel. And this challenges the notion that if all Palestinians were to suddenly leave, this would solve some of the biggest problems of this area in the Middle East, something which has actually been proposed by certain political leaders recently. And so this is a very inventive way of considering this long-standing conflict. But more than this and the big political issues at stake, I was just so drawn into the emotional lives of these characters and their relationship to each other. This novel was first published in Arabic in 2014, and an English language version was first published in 2019. The narrative brings this sudden occurrence, this disappearance to life through the voices and competing opinions of those who remain, but it's primarily focused through the lens of an Israeli journalist named Ariel, who reads through the notebooks of his vanished Palestinian friend and neighbor named Allah, while Ariel writes news articles on reactions to the ongoing situation. But even before the big event occurs in this story, I was immediately pulled into it because of a very beautiful opening section where Allah describes the death of his beloved grandmother, and I felt his sense of grief so intensely, especially through this often repeated metaphor where he says, "Longing for you is like holding a rose of thorns." And it's touching how the grandmother's charismatic presence and staunch devotion to Jaffa seem to fill this entire novel, even though she dies at the very beginning. And her loss, which precedes the entire Palestinian people's disappearance, seems to underpin a much larger question, which is posed in various ways throughout the story, which is, what remains in a landscape when part of its people and culture have gone or been destroyed? It's compelling how the initial disappearance of the Palestinians is viewed from a number of different characters in the community whose lives are impacted by this sudden loss. There are inconveniences and larger immediate problems, such as the loss of manual labor and delayed buses and shops being closed and medical procedures being cancelled, but then these gradually build to much larger tensions concerning how the state of Israel will function without any Palestinian Arabs. And the state requires that everyone who remains must immediately register their citizenship as a way of definitively categorizing who belongs and who doesn't. I really appreciated how the author represented a wide range of opinions, from highly prejudiced to fearful to sympathetic to simply indifferent. From what I understand, some of these points of view were taken from, or at least inspired by, real interviews and speeches. We're only given small glimpses of a number of characters' lives, but I found this to be structured in a really effective way because it creates these snapshots of so many different voices and reactions. It shows the deep-seated rhetoric believed by some that Israel is the only democratic nation in this region and that Palestinian Arabs are a threatening, inconvenient presence that need to be controlled. But others assume that their disappearance must have somehow been orchestrated by the Israeli state, and they worry for their welfare. One of the interesting things about the central central characters in this novel of Ala and Ariel is that their fathers are absent for different reasons, and the reasons for their fathers' deaths influence each man's beliefs and how they are perceived within their own communities. They are friends, and there are accounts of how they socialize with one another, but there are also sections which show how they have very different beliefs which stem from competing ideological stances and their respective positions within society. Initially, I felt a bit uncertain about how much I actually believed that this friendship was real, and I think that's partly because of the way that the novel is structured. But as the story went on, I came to understand that they have quite a complicated connection with one another and a strong bond. And in particular, there's a very striking scene where Ala has a rant at Ariel because Ariel is not seeing his point of view. And Ariel himself is quite a complicated character because he's in some ways liberal, but also adheres to Zionist beliefs, and there are scenes from his past which are shown which are quite disturbing, and it's increasingly unsettling how he comes to inhabit Allah's apartment, even though he's only been gone for a very short period of time. Ariel freely reads through Allah's notebooks and drinks his wine and sleeps in his bed and eventually takes measures to change the locks. Even though they shared a friendship, Ariel seems to revert to this stance where any space which is abandoned by Palestinians can be freely taken, and he feels justified in doing so. However, there is a tension which remains, and it's really haunting the way that this is portrayed in the story. And also in Allah's apartment, there's a very strange painting of a figure who is entirely cloaked except for their eyes, and so it's like this figure is continuing to bear witness. One of the most devastating and disturbing sections of this novel concerns a much older former Israeli soldier named Diane, who recalls witnessing and being involved with the terrorization and rape of an Arab woman and man. He's continued seeing the woman on the streets for many years, but now that the Palestinians have vanished, he's not able to ask for her forgiveness anymore, and paradoxically, he resents her for depriving him of that opportunity. This passage seems to function as both a literal account, but it's also symbolic of how, if the Palestinians were to disappear, there would be no way for the Israelis to atone for their oppressive actions. And some members of my book club posed an intriguing question where they wondered if the woman was actually Allah's grandmother and if Diane was related to Ariel in some way. And I don't think this is the case because the woman, I think, disappears along with all of the other Palestinians, but I'd be really intrigued if you've read this book, if you have any other ideas on this, or if you had this notion as well. This novel feels to me like it's somewhere between a documentary and a piece of speculative fiction because of all the points of view we get from various individuals. It builds to this overall narrative that a nation creates about itself to justify its policies and actions. There's a statement in the novel that really stood out to me where it's written, "An illusion is enough to live the lie that later becomes the truth." As the Palestinians are pushed out of the country, imprisoned or killed, there's a danger that their narrative and their point of view will disappear or be erased. And Allah describes why he maintains a notebook. I write to remember and to remind, so memories are not erased. Memory is my last lifeline. So even though the novel describes a fantastical occurrence which is never explained, it doesn't feel so much like speculative fiction because the disappearance of the Palestinians has been occurring in a literal way ever since the Nakba and 1948 events, which are recalled in a really powerful way by the grandmother. Some readers have expressed concerns over whether this novel gives a balanced take on this conflict, given that the author is Palestinian, and certainly she is coming from a certain point of view, and she's also a journalist. However, this book isn't an article or a piece of nonfiction, it's a novel, and like all artistic creations, it necessarily comes from a subjective perspective. And I'm in no way an expert on this conflict, but the atrocities experienced by both the Palestinians and the Israelis is well documented, and I think this book gives a really refreshing new point of view and way of considering all of these things. And it also made me think of the recent documentary called No Other Land, which won an Oscar recently, and it feels especially relevant for this story because within that documentary it describes the connection and friendship between an Israeli and a Palestinian. So I'd really recommend watching this documentary as well because it's very powerful. Overall, I felt this novel meaningfully shows how a place truly comes to life through the multiplicity of experiences and perspectives of its different citizens. The many characters view this one place in many different ways, and when some of those characters are lost, then there's a longing for these perspectives. So the removal of each individual is not only a physical absence, but mean that an essential part of this place's character has been lost. And although this is a very specific story, its concepts and ideas could easily be applied to so many different areas of the world which have been colonized or where there are deep-seated conflicts between cultures, religions, and nationalities. I can think of some literary comparisons to this book, like the novel Exit West by Mohsin Hamid, or the novel Blindness by Jose Saramago, which some readers have remarked upon, and the author herself has described how Saramago has been such a strong influence. But I think this novel does something so unique and new, especially in portraying a very emotional relationship between a young man and his grandmother, and that is something that has really stuck with me. So I loved reading this book, and I think it is really going to stay with me for a long period of time. I would love to hear if you have read this book or if you're interested in reading it now, but I hope you're doing well and reading good things, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.